In this video, I'm going to show you how to go from taking portraits like this to portraits like this. Let's get into it. There are many ways that you can make your subject stand out more or pop in your photos. Some of these are decisions that you make when you're taking the photo, like camera settings, your lens choice, and placing of your subject. Other ways are to use little tricks in post-processing of the images after the fact. Today, I have a mix of 5 of these techniques that will help you up your portrait game. Alright, so the first of these techniques that you can use is to use a wider aperture. A main technique that photographers use in order to get really good portraits is to get that blurry background feel in your portraits. Now, personally, I like to shoot my portraits at around f2.8, but if you have a lens that is capable of opening up even wider than that, you can do that to get that blurry background. Now, what you don't want is an image like this, where your subject essentially blends into the background. This happened in this image because I took the shot at f16, which doesn't really give any separation at all between the background and the subject. Here's the same photo taken at f2.8, and you can really see the difference between the f2.8 shot and the f16 shot in the sense that you get a lot more separation between the subject and the background. Now, the amount that you can open up your aperture is going to largely be dictated by the lens that you're shooting with. Some lenses, like the one that I use to shoot these examples, have the capability of opening up to f2.8. Other lenses, like this cheaper 50mm Sony lens, even have the capability of opening up wider to f1.8. In general, the wider a lens can open up, the more expensive that lens is going to be. Obviously, with the 50mm 1.8 lens, this is an exception to this rule, and it's why I recommend getting a 50mm lens if you don't have a huge budget for a lens. You'll hear a lot that 50mm is how your eye sees the world, which is why a lot of photographers think 50mm gets you the best results for portraits. Other focal lengths that are really popular for portraits are 35mm and 85mm. Obviously, the lens that you choose to use for your portraits is going to be highly dependent on your own personal style as a photographer. What I recommend is that you just pick one of these lenses that fits within your budget. Then just experiment with it and see if you like it. If you don't like it, you can always resell it or just buy another one and see if you like that one better. Another in-camera technique you can use to try and get more separation between your subject and the background is to use a longer focal length. Here are essentially the same shots that were taken at 35mm, 50mm, and 70mm, all taken with the same aperture of f2.8. You can see the difference in how the lens compression when you go from 35 to 50 to 70 mils makes a difference and makes your subject start to stand out more. This is another reason why photographers like using an 85mm lens, because they really have that unique compressed look to them that a lot of people like. This next technique is awesome because it doesn't matter what lens you're using or what focal length you're shooting at. For this technique, all you need to do is just get your subject to stand a little further away from the background. Take this shot, for example. The model, my fiance in this case, was standing pretty much directly in front of the trees in the background. Now, because I was shooting at 70mm and with an aperture of f2.8, there is still some separation, but as you can see, she kind of blends into the trees. Now, look what happens as she just takes a few steps forward and the difference it makes in making her pop out more or stand out more from the background. Now, depending on the focal length that you're shooting with and the aperture that you're shooting at, you actually may need to pull them a little bit further away from the background than this, but just play around with getting your model to take a few steps further away from the background and see the difference it makes in your image. All right, this next one is one of my favorites, and it's creating Lightroom masks. So let's jump into Lightroom. So the first thing you're gonna wanna do is create a mask, and you're gonna wanna do this by clicking on this little mask icon and then select subject. What this will do is select your entire subject magically for you with Lightroom's powerful AI. What I like to do when the subject is selected is just bump the exposure a little bit. Not so much that you make them overexposed, but enough that it really highlights them. I also like to take this mask and add some sharpening to it. All right, we're not done here. Next thing you want to do is create another mask and select the background. Once the background is selected, drop the exposure just a little bit in order to really get that separation between your subject and the background. That's really the theme in this whole video, is just creating separation from the subject to the background to really make them stand out or pop. You could just call it a day here, but I like to add a couple more linear gradient masks just to make a little bit more of a emphasis on the center of the frame. So I'll add one at the bottom, on the left, on the right, maybe on the top, and just kind of draw all the attention into the center of the frame. You can also just add a vignette to your photo, but I typically like to do this with masks, just so I get a little more control over that vignette. All right, so now that we've done all of our masks, here's what the photo looked like before, after. Before, after. Here's a little side by side so you can see them at the same time. And you can really see the difference these masks make in order to make your subject stand out more. This last technique is one that can be applied to any image, not just portraits, and it is to adjust the contrast and the colors of your image. Now, everyone's workflow for editing looks a little different, but for me, it typically goes like this. I start off with the basic adjustments. So I adjust the whites, the shadows, the highlights, and the blacks in order to get a decent exposure and a decent starting point of my image. The next thing I like to do is actually go right into the color calibration tool. If you're not using this tool already, I highly recommend that you learn how to use it. It really takes your images to the next level in terms of coloring. Now, for a long time, I didn't use the color calibration tool. I just used the HSL sliders. But once I learned how to use the color calibration tool, it really took my images to the next level. Now, every image is going to be a little different when it comes to what I do with this color calibration tab, whether it's a fall image or a summer image, but how I start them is usually the same way. I usually start off by going into the blue primary and increasing the saturation. You'll see that as I increase the blue saturation, it not only increases the saturation of the blues, but just the entire image as a whole is more punchy or has more saturation to it. I don't want this video to be an entire tutorial on how to use the color calibration tool, but I'll just give you a quick rundown of what it's doing. Every pixel in your image is made up of either blue, green, or red. Actually, of some combination of all three of those. What the color calibration tab does, it essentially adjusts those on your image as a whole. So if I increase the saturation of the blue primary, it increases every single pixel that has blue in it, which is every pixel in my image. If I shift the entire blue primary in order to be more teal, you can see how it affects not just the blues in the image, but it affects every color in the image. You can get some really cool effects in your images if you start playing around with this tab, and I recommend that you do so. All right, so in this image, I am going to stick with increasing my blues just a little bit. I'll bring my blues a little bit, maybe toward the teal, and I'll play with the green a little bit here. I don't think I'm gonna touch the red on this image, maybe a little bit. And there you go. And this is what it looks like before and after. You can really see how playing with this tab really just makes your image pop more. It makes the colors more punchy, it makes it more saturated, but not too saturated. All right, the last thing I like to adjust is typically the tone curve, and I typically do this at the end just to kind of bring out a little more contrast in the image. I don't go too far with this. I typically just do a standard S curve and kind of play with it until the image looks appealing to the eye. Now, just for fun, because we just went over this, let's add some masks in order to really round out this image and complete it. All right, so I'll select the subject and increase the exposure just a little bit. And then I'll go ahead and select the background and decrease the exposure just a little bit. And then I'll add a couple gradient filters here just to draw the attention to the center a little more. And just like that, we go from an image that looked pretty flat and boring to an image now which pops with color, contrast, and just really stands out more as a whole. All right guys, that's it for this video. I hope you found something useful in this video. If you did and you want to keep seeing content like this, Be sure to leave a comment below with future topics that you want to see covered. Hit that subscribe button so you don't miss out on my next video, and I will see you in the next one.